Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. Welcome to a special deep dive from the Last Minute Lecture team. I'm so glad you're joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for studying along with us. We're going to be jumping into Chapter 20 of Guyton and Hall's Textbook of Medical Physiology, the 15th edition.
Right, and our mission today is to deeply understand cardiac output, venous return, and, how they're regulated.
Exactly. And we want to do this without getting lost in the weeds. We are taking all those dense mechanisms from the chapter and translating them into plain logical steps that build on one another.
Because usually when you visualize the human body, there's this inherent assumption about the hierarchy of it all. You probably picture the heart as the absolute CEO of the body.
Oh, 100%. It feels so intuitive. The pump must be in charge of the pumping.
Right. It sits right there in the center of the chest, beating away, dictating exactly how much blood goes where, and all the other organs just sort of wait in line for their rations.
But today, we're going to completely flip that assumption on its head. The moment you look at the actual mechanisms governing cardiovascular physiology, that whole corporate structure gets inverted.
It's the ultimate lesson in decentralized management, which is wild. So to really grasp how this works, we have to establish the physical loop happening inside you right now.
Right. There are two fundamental flows we're tracking here.
Yeah. You have cardiac output, which is the amount of blood the heart pumps into the aorta every single minute.
And then you have venous return, which is the amount of blood flowing from your veins back into the right atrium each minute. And crucially, these two volumes have to be identical.
Wait, they have to be exactly equal. Always.
I mean, except for maybe a few transient heartbeats if you suddenly stand up or start running. But yeah, overall, because it's a closed loop, what goes out must equal what comes back in.
Okay, that makes sense. So looking at the baseline numbers from the text, a healthy young adult just resting on the couch is moving about 5 liters of blood through that loop every minute.
Right. It's about 5.6 liters per minute for a young man and 4.9 for a young woman. So we just average it to roughly 5 liters.
But 5 liters is just a raw average. I mean, a person who is 6'5" and heavily muscled clearly needs a different baseline flow than someone who's 5'2".
Exactly. Which is why physiologists use something called the cardiac index. Size matters here.
Right.
So we take that total cardiac output and divide it by the person's body surface area.
Okay, so what's a normal index then?
The average adult rests at a cardiac index of about 3 liters per minute per square meter of body surface area.
And there's this fascinating graph in the textbook, I think it's figure 20.1, tracking that index across a human lifespan.
Yeah, the curve is really interesting.
It peaks surprisingly early. It hits over 4 liters per minute per square meter around age 10, and then slowly, steadily declines down to about 2.4 by age 80.
Which perfectly reflects the gradual loss of skeletal muscle mass and, just the overall slowing of our metabolic rate as we age.
There is also this really cool detail regarding obesity. You might assume carrying significant excess weight would just automatically drive your cardiac index through the roof.
You'd think so, yeah. More body, more blood flow needed.
Right, but adipose tissue, fat tissue, actually requires vastly less blood flow per gram compared to highly active muscle tissue.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So a person's total cardiac output will definitely increase to supply the extra mass. But because fat is a relatively low-demand tissue, their overall cardiac index might barely change at all.
That's a great point. It's kind of like...
It's like measuring a car's fuel efficiency, right?
Yeah.
You base it on its weight and engine size rather than just looking at the raw gallons burned per minute. It just makes it a fair comparison across different bodies.
I like that analogy, and that brings us perfectly to the central plot twist of this whole chapter. The shift from function to regulation.
The inverted hierarchy we teased earlier.
Exactly. Under normal conditions, the heart does not decide the cardiac output. The peripheral tissues do.
The tissues are pulling the strings.
Yep. The local tissues open their blood vessels based on what they need. The blood rushes back to the heart, and the heart just immediately pumps it right back out.
So the heart is basically just a servant.
Pretty much. And this instantaneous adaptation relies on a core concept called the Frank-Starling law of the heart.
Let's break down the mechanics of that because it really is so elegant.
Yeah, so when extra blood flows into the heart from the veins, it physically stretches the heart muscle.
You're literally stretching the walls of the cardiac chambers.
Exactly. And pulling on those cardiac muscle fibers slides the actin and myosin filaments inside the cells into a much more optimal alignment.
So when they trigger to contract, they can form more cross bridges.
Right. So they contract with significantly greater force. The heart automatically pumps harder simply because it was stretched by the extra blood.
Wait, let me make sure I had this straight. Stretching the heart physically makes it pump with more force. But doesn't it also need to pump faster to handle all that extra volume?
It absolutely does. And that's where the Bainbridge reflex comes in.
Okay, what's that?
So stretching the right atrium physically pulls on the sinus node, which is the heart's natural pacemaker. That mechanical stretch alone increases your heart rate by about 10 to 15%.
Wow, just from the physical stretching.
Yeah, but it also triggers nerve signals that fire up to the brain. And the brain immediately fires sympathetic signals right back down to the heart to speed it up even further.
Okay, so stretching the chamber increases the force and the rate all at once.
You got it. And we can see this play out perfectly when you look at local metabolism. Figure 20.3 in the text walks through this with exercise.
Right, so the moment your skeletal muscles start working, they burn through their local oxygen.
And in response to that drop in oxygen, the blood vessels in the muscle just dilate. They open up wide.
Which drops the resistance.
Exactly.
Reminds me of that formula from the text. Ohm's law of the heart.
Oh, yeah. Cardiac output equals arterial pressure divided by total peripheral resistance.
Right. So if you massively drop the resistance by opening all those vessels in the legs, a flood of blood rushes through the muscle and dumps straight back into the veins.
And then venous return spikes, the heart stretches, Frank-Starling kicks in, and cardiac output shoots up in perfect parallel with your oxygen consumption.
But the heart is still just a physical muscle, right? It has to have an absolute structural ceiling.
It definitely does. Which leads us to the cardiac function curves.
Figured 20.5, I think.
Yeah. Imagine a graph where the horizontal axis is right atrial pressure and the vertical axis is cardiac output.
Okay, so as filling pressure of the stretch goes up, the output goes up.
Right. But eventually, a normal resting heart hits a hard plateau at about 13 liters per minute.
Which is only about 2.5 times the normal resting output of 5 liters.
Exactly. That is the absolute limit of what a normal heart can pump without extra stimulation.
Oh, wait. How do we break past that plateau? Because humans can definitely pump more than 13 liters a minute, like athletes survive sprints.
To push past that, the body transitions the heart into a hypereffective state. And there are two main factors here.
Okay, what's the first one?
Nervous stimulation. The sympathetic nervous system floods the heart with signals that can crank the heart rate up to 200 beats per minute, and it literally doubles the contractile strength of the muscle.
That's the fast way. What's the second factor?
Heart hypertrophy. Increased muscle mass from long-term conditioning.
Oh, right. The marathon runner example from the text is wild.
Yeah, it's pretty extreme.
A serious marathoner has both a hypertrophied heart, like 50 to 75% more mass, and they get that sympathetic stimulation during a race.
Right.
So their curve doesn't plateau at 13. It shifts way up, plateauing at 30 to 40 liters per minute.
Which is incredible. But we also have to contrast that with hypoeffective hearts, factors that suppress the curve downward.
Like what?
Like severe hypertension. If the blood pressure is too high, there's too much pressure for the heart to pump against. Or things like heart attacks or hypoxia. The damaged muscle just can't contract forcefully.
So in those states, the heart struggles to even reach the normal baseline.
Exactly.
Okay, but I have a major pushback here on the whole tissues control the flow concept.
Okay, let's hear it.
If you go for a run and the blood vessels in your leg muscles dilate wide open to get more oxygen, your total peripheral resistance should plummet.
It does.
Well, if resistance drops that severely, shouldn't your blood pressure just completely crash? Like, why don't we pass out every single time we jog?
That is the perfect question, and it's exactly why the autonomic nervous system is the unsung hero of this whole chapter.
How so?
There is this dramatic experiment in the book Figure 20.6 using dogs and a metabolic drug called dinitrophenol.
Dinitrophenol, right.
Yeah.
It basically ramps up the tissue metabolism artificially, like fourfold.
Right. The tissue starts screaming for oxygen. So in the experiment, they chemically block the autonomic nervous system first and then give the drug.
Okay.
The starving tissues react locally by dilating their blood vessels wide open. But because the nervous system is blocked, nothing intervenes.
So what happens?
Total peripheral resistance plummets, arterial pressure crashes to half of normal, and cardiac output barely increases at all.
Wow. The system basically stalls out because there's no pressure to drive the blood back to the heart.
Exactly. But when they repeat the experiment with the nervous system left intact, it's a completely different story.
So the drug increases metabolism, The vessels dilate.
But the instant the blood pressure starts to fall, the intact nervous system detects it and triggers a massive sympathetic reflex.
The rescue mechanism.
Yes. It forcibly constricts the large veins to push blood back to the heart, it ramps up the heart rate, and it actively maintains the arterial pressure.
It actually raises the arterial pressure above normal during exercise, doesn't it? Just to force that blood into the working muscles.
It does. So your brain is simultaneously sending motor signals to your muscles to run and sympathetic signals to your veins and heart to keep the pressure up.
The local tissues lower the resistance to invite the blood in, but the nervous system has to maintain the driving pressure so the blood actually arrives.
Exactly. And when that delicate balance breaks, you end up with some serious pathology.
All right, let's talk about when the system breaks. Figure 20.7 catalogs these diseases based on cardiac output.
Let's start with chronically high cardiac output. There's a surprising pattern here.
Yeah, none of the high output diseases are caused by an overactive heart.
None of them. They're all caused by reduced peripheral resistance. The vessels are pathologically dilated.
Like Burberry, right. That's a severe vitamin B1 deficiency.
Right. Without B1, the tissues can't use oxygen. They're essentially suffocating, so they continuously release local factors causing their vessels to dilate.
So resistance drops, and the heart has to double its output just to force more unused oxygen past the tissues.
Exactly. Another one is an AV fistula, which is a direct abnormal shunt from a major artery right into a major vein.
A literal short circuit in the plumbing.
Yep. The blood bypasses the high-resistance capillary beds entirely. Resistance drops. Output skyrockets.
The text also mentions hyperthyroidism, which increases metabolism and causes widespread vasodilation, and anemia, where reduced blood viscosity and lower oxygen delivery again force the vessels to dilate.
In all of them, the tissues drop the resistance and the heart just desperately tries to keep up.
Okay, so what about chronically low cardiac output?
That splits into two distinct mechanical camps. The first is just a broken pump.
Like a heart attack or severe valvular disease, the heart itself can't generate force.
Right. The second camp is decreased venous return. The pump is totally fine, but the well has run dry.
Decreased blood volume, like from a severe hemorrhage.
Or fainting, which is an acute venous dilation. Your nervous system loses tone, and the blood just pools in your leg veins instead of returning to your chest.
And prolonged bed rest does this too, right? Because your muscle mass decreases, your metabolic rate drops, and the tissues just don't demand as much flow.
Exactly. Now, to really master this, to understand extreme stress on the body, we have to merge the heart's pumping ability with systemic flow into one integrated model.
Putting the curves together.
Yes. But first, we have to acknowledge external pressures, like breathing or cardiac tamponade.
Tamponade is when fluid accumulates in the rigid sac around the heart, right?
Right. That fluid physically squeezes the heart. It acts like a hydraulic straitjacket, so that shifts the cardiac output curve to the right.
Meaning the heart needs much higher atrial filling pressure just to pry itself open and pump normally.
Exactly. So that's the heart's limitation. But the venous return curve has its own physical limits.
Let's paint a picture of that venous return curve.
Okay, so on the left side of the graph, if right atrial pressure drops into negative numbers, venous return actually plateaus. It doesn't just keep going up.
Why?
Because negative pressure in the chest acts like a vacuum. It literally sucks the floppy veins shut where they enter the chest. They collapse.
Wow, okay. But as atrial pressure rises, venous return drops. And according to the text, it hits exactly zero flow at 7 millimeters of mercury.
Yeah.
Wait, why does all blood flow completely stop just because atrial pressure hits 7?
This is one of the coolest concepts in the chapter. It means systemic filling pressure. Or F.
Okay, Beth, explain that.
Imagine your entire vascular system is a slightly overfilled water balloon. Even if the fluid isn't moving, the walls are stretched. They exert a baseline squeezing pressure on the fluid.
Like the tightness of the system.
Exactly. If you clamped off the heart and stopped all blood flow, the pressure would equalize everywhere. That baseline resting pressure is the FOOF. And in a normal human, it's 7 millimeters of mercury.
It's determined by blood volume and how tightly the sympathetic nervous system is constricting the vessels, right?
Right. So if the baseline pushing pressure from your tissues is 7 and your right atrial pressure backs up to equal 7.
7 equals 7, the pressure gradient completely disappears.
Exactly. No downhill slope, no flow. Venous return drops to 0.
That makes perfect sense. So if you put the cardiac output curve and the venous return curve on the exact same graph figure 20.15, they form an X.
And where they intersect is reality. That's the equilibrium point, point A.
which normally sits at a cardiac output of 5 liters per minute and a right atrial pressure of 0.
Yes, and we can use that intersection to track a dynamic trauma. Let's walk through the exact sequence of opening an AV fistula. Figure 20.17 maps this out.
The short circuit between the artery and vein. Okay, I'll start immediately, like minute 1, the fistula opens. Blood bypasses the capillaries, so resistance plummets.
The venous return curve rotates sharply upward.
And the cardiac output instantly jumps to 13 liters per minute.
But then, 1 minute later, the sympathetic nervous system panics over the slight pressure drop.
The baroreceptors kick in.
Right. It aggressively constricts the veins, which raises the SFOF from 7 up to 9, and it stimulates the heart to pump harder. So cardiac output hits 16 liters per minute.
Okay, fast forward several weeks later. The kidneys have been retaining salt and water because of the slightly low blood pressure.
So total blood volume expands. The water balloon is stuffed even more, pushing the fife all the way to 12.
And the overworked heart actually hypertrophies. The new equilibrium settles at nearly 20 liters per minute.
The body restructures its entire fluid dynamics to survive the short circuit.
It's incredible. But how do doctors actually measure this in real life? You can't just surgically install a flow meter on a patient's aorta.
No, you definitely cannot. We have to use physics, specifically the Fick principle.
Figure 20.19. There's basically an oxygen conservation of mass equation, right?
Right.
I always think of it like figuring out how many cars pass through a drive-through.
Oh, this is a fun analogy. Let's hear it.
Okay, so if you know exactly 200 burgers were handed out the window in total, and you know every single car took exactly 40 burgers.
That is so many burgers for one car.
I know, just go with it.
Yeah.
You divide 200 by 40, and you instantly know that 5 cars went through the drive-through.
It works perfectly. So putting that into textbook numbers, you measure the patient and find their lungs are absorbing exactly 200 milliliters of oxygen per minute.
Okay, that's the total burgers handed out.
Right. Then you measure venous blood and find it has 160 milliliters of oxygen per liter, and arterial blood has 200 milliliters per liter.
The difference is 40. Every liter of blood picked up exactly 40 milliliters of oxygen.
Exactly. So 200 total divided by 40 per liter equals 5 liters of blood per minute.
It's just so elegant. Now, there's also the indicator dilution method in figure 20.20, right?
Yeah, that's where a doctor injects a known amount of dye, like cardiogreen, into the right atrium.
And then they measure its concentration as it washes out of an artery.
Right. They plot the curve, use some math to filter out the dye that recirculates, and the area under the curve reveals the exact volume of blood that diluted the dye.
But both of those require invasive catheters. Do we have non-invasive methods now?
We do. Echocardiography is a big one. It uses ultrasound to physically measure the aorta's size and the velocity of the blood jetting through it.
Which lets you calculate stroke volume and output.
Yep. There is also thoracic electrical bioimpedance.
How does that work?
It uses electrodes on the skin to measure how the electrical conductivity of the chest changes as blood surges in and out with each heartbeat.
Oh, that sounds super convenient.
It is, but the text notes a major caveat. It can have an error rate of 20 to 40%. Fluid in the lungs or weird heart rhythms can easily throw off the electrical readings.
So the search for the perfect non-invasive method is still ongoing.
Very much so.
Well, we've traced the baseline volumes, scaled the index, stretched the sarcomeres, mapped the equilibrium curves, and measured the oxygen extraction. What is the final provocative thought you want to leave everyone with?
I want you to really think about the brilliant efficiency of local independence. Your heart is ultimately a blind pump.
A blind pump.
Yeah. It has no idea you're running a marathon or recovering from an injury. It just faithfully pumps whatever blood your individual cells demand and send back to it.
The intelligence of the system isn't centralized in the pump.
Exactly. It's radically decentralized in every single capillary of your body.
That is such a cool way to look at it. A warm thank you from the Last Minute Lecture team here at The Deep Dive. Good luck with your medical physiology journey, and keep asking great questions.